But today we're really excited to have Paul Stimers and a team from K&L Gates. They're going to talk to us about the recently passed CARES Act, answer any questions and try to figure out how do we navigate all this. It's one of the most significant acts ever passed. I think final tally with $2.2 trillion. It's sort of unimaginable, but then again, these are unimaginable times. But just quickly, just to show you a little bit, K&L Gates is a fully integrated global law firm. They have lawyers and staff across 5 continents, and they're able to respond to a whole host of different types of legal issues and risks through the services of their one firm and what they offer clients. And then especially Paul Stimers, and Paul, thank you very much for helping to coordinate this with us. Paul focuses his policy advocacy efforts on matters related to emerging technologies, commercial space flight, IT, nanotechnology, water technology, and a whole host of others. So a really interesting portfolio and background there. So Paul, again, thank you, and thank you for bringing your team out. If anybody has any questions as we're going along, please send them to us in chat, and we'll try to get to those. And I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So with that, Paul, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jack, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning and to be active members of the Board of Trade. The past few weeks have been extremely busy for us as we've been working to help ensure that the coronavirus legislation does as much as it can to help end this crisis and get the economy back on its feet. I'll start very briefly with a quick recap of the legislation so far and then introduce my team to get into the details of what it's doing and what it's going to do, and most importantly, I think, how to navigate it. So we had phase 1, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, passed in March 6th. That was $8.3 billion, and it was mostly HHS funding for outbreak response. Phase 2 was the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act. That was March 18th. That was $105 billion and included paid sick leave, unemployment insurance, free testing, that sort of thing. So phase 3 was the CARES Act, and that was March 27th. And as you say, that was $2.2 trillion. We'll talk more about what's in it, but here's a quick list. Unemployment benefits, one-time checks, loans, grants, loan guarantees, state aid, health spending, safety net spending, disaster assistance, education, support for transportation industries, tax cuts, and so forth. Now, Congress has gone out until April 20th, but when they come back, as everybody I think is aware, they'll likely take up a phase 4 bill. That will likely be focused on infrastructure and have the intent of being a stimulus, as well as wrapping up some other coronavirus response specific provisions. We're going to be talking more about that too, but I have to say, the price tag on these bills has been rising exponentially. And I ran the data last night because as your bio at the beginning of the call indicates, I'm kind of a nerd. And the curve fitter says that if Congress passes phase 4 right away on April 20th, the bill will cost $11 quadrillion. So we've been spending money that we don't have, but $11 quadrillion is money that we don't have. So we have to flatten that curve too. And we're currently hearing from the President and the Speaker that they'd like to see phase 4 come in at about another $2 trillion, which is still a staggering amount of money. So with so much money going out the door between these 4 bills and with so many people needing help, it's going to be hard for the government to do it right and to do it quickly. And so we'll talk with you a little bit this morning about how to navigate what will be a difficult process for actually accessing this money as well. So I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues, Mary Baker, Karishma Page, and Brenden Chainey. Mary leads our tax practice, which she joined after a distinguished career at the IRS and the Senate Finance Committee. Karishma leads our healthcare policy practice and deals extensively with tax, financial services, retirement, and employee benefits issues. And Brenden joined our policy practice after a career on Capitol Hill and at a technology startup working in healthcare policy. So Mary, I'd like to turn it over to you, and thank you all 3 of you for joining this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am going to talk primarily about the tax provisions that are, I just want to make sure I have my sound turned up if everyone can hear me okay. The tax provisions that are in the CARES Act, I think that they can be characterized as primarily focusing on cash flow, both for individuals and for businesses, and also focusing on allowing businesses to be able to keep their workforce in place so that as the economy recovers, they have a workforce to come back to and they don't have to retrain their workforce, which is very important. I know that you're focused primarily on businesses, but we also, our clients have been feeding information to their employees because their employees are understandably very anxious about where their next dollar is going to come from. So very quickly, the cash flow issues in the bill that are focused on employees include the individual rebates that we've all been hearing a lot about. They are hoping, the IRS is hoping to start issuing those checks within the next 3 weeks using pretty much the template that we designed when I was on the Hill in 2008, 2009 and worked on the stimulus provisions then. There's also some relief if employees are taking distributions out of their retirement plans. The 10% early withdrawal penalty is waived for 2020 up to withdrawals of $100,000, and there's no required minimum distributions, so the value of their portfolio is down. At least they're not drawing down further on that. There's some additional provisions, relief on charitable deductions to be able to encourage charitable donations during this time. And employers also are authorized to pay up to $5,250 to employees to help them service their student loans. This is sort of a tack on to paying educational benefits. It's all part of that same code section. So that will provide some relief for employees in addition to some of the other issues that are going to be talked about today, including really greatly expanded unemployment benefits. On the employer side, there are a number of provisions. Some of them have received more publicity than others. Probably the one that's received the most publicity is the employer payroll deferral. And you notice that I put emphasis on the word deferral. It is not a holiday, as many employers were hoping. It is merely a deferral of employment taxes through the employer share of employment taxes through the end of 2020. Then the employers will be required to pay half of that deferral back by the end of 2021, the other half by the end of 2022. One of the little details that doesn't get a lot of publicity is, and I think we're going to talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, the SBA loans, later in the program, but if the employer is benefiting from the loan forgiveness provision in that Paycheck Protection Program, the employer will not qualify for the employer payroll deferral. So those are the kinds of little details that we are not hearing a lot about that are really important to read the fine print before you proceed and make a decision. Do I go with the SBA loan forgiveness or do I go with the employer payroll deferral? Another employer benefit is the employee retention credit, and this is intended to help keep employees on the payroll. So employers can take, if employees are furloughed, for large employers, the employees actually have to not be providing services. For smaller employers, the employees can still be continuing to work. But employers are entitled to a 50% credit against payroll taxes up to $10,000, so $5,000 per employee. So that should be helpful. There are also, in the second stimulus bill, there were the family and sick leave payments that are required that smaller employers between 50 and less than 500 employees are required to pay. And in order to offset the cost of the family and sick leave payments, the employers are entitled to a tax credit, again, against payroll taxes. And that includes both the employer share of FICA and also the Medicare taxes in this particular case. So those credits will also provide the cash, help provide the cash flow to be able to make the sick and family leave payments. The IRS just came out yesterday with some new instructions on how to claim. You can claim an advance refund or advance payment of some of those credits. They have a brand new form, Form 7200. Even former bureaucrats always love a new tax form. So there's a new form right now that is a COVID-related form. Then very quickly, some of the other provisions, the business provisions for to encourage tax flow. Some of them are pauses on some of the offsets that were included in the tax reform bill. One of the things that was done in that bill was to repeal the carryback of net operating losses. Those now have been reinstated for any losses in years 2018, 19, and 20, and they can be carried back to hopefully profitable years as far as 5 years back to be able to get some cash flow coming in for those refunds. AMT credits, to the extent that the corporate AMT was repealed in the tax reform bill, and then there was a spread of time to be able to claim any unused AMT credits. Those can now be taken right away to be able to get more cash flow. Interest expense deduction, the 30% limit on taxable income for the deduction has now been relaxed and is now 50% for the time being. And then they also notably fixed the qualified improvement property technical glitch in the tax reform bill. So that will encourage, as we start back on the road to recovery, that will encourage businesses to do leasehold improvements and other interior improvements, and that will now qualify for 100% bonus depreciation. So that, in a nutshell, is the business or the tax provisions that are in the CARES bill.
Mary, we did get a question submitted via the chat.
Yes.
Can an employer do the employee retention credit and also the SBA loan forgiveness?
I look specifically to see, because generally the CARES Act is designed to avoid double dipping. But I did not see any prohibition against qualifying for the two of those. I specifically looked for that because there is the prohibition with the employer payroll holiday, or not holiday, but deferral. But I did not see a similar prohibition for the employee retention credit.
Thank you, Mary.
Karishma.
Great. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for being with you this morning. And thank you, Paul and Mary, for the introduction. What I want to do is cover 3 buckets in our discussion this morning. One, to follow on to Mary's discussion about what may be available to businesses, both from a tax perspective and to deal with workforce issues. I want to then transition that discussion into what is available from the UI perspective, unemployment insurance perspective, which is a big tranche of what this bill does. And then what I want to do is move into a discussion about what types of funding and loan types of facilities are available. And I want to start that discussion first on the healthcare side, because obviously that is another key focus of this bill, and then move over to some of the other types of facilities that are being contemplated in the bill. Largely from a larger business perspective, which I think will then transition into the SBA piece, which Brenden will be covering here just shortly. So just starting to talk specifically about unemployment compensation, I think there are a number of provisions in this legislation that are intended to expand the scope of unemployment. The first, and I will say, as Mary has mentioned, I think there are perceptions of what these provisions do, in part because of some of the talking points that have been put out there. But in reality, I think when you look at the details, the bill does something slightly different. So, for instance, one of the key provisions on the unemployment insurance compensation side is that an individual that is receiving UI will be able to receive what they're eligible for under their state law, and then an additional $600 per week payment through July 2020. I think there was some confusion here about this being suggested as being an additional 4 months. It's not an additional 4 months from when that UI starts, but instead it is that 4 months is really basically the time from now until the end of July. It also, there was some confusion, and this was one of the last hiccups that occurred in the bill, I think there was a perception here that it was up to an additional $600, not actually just an additional $600. So one of the last hiccups on the bill was there was sort of this debate about whether in some instances where that may be a lower compensated employee, that perhaps under this new regime they could be making more than what they would be in a job, and so would that be an incentive to become unemployed? And so that is something actually that is really the additional $600 per week through the end of July 2020, and that is being compensated by the federal government to the states. And then another additional expansion of unemployment insurance is that the federal government would be providing an additional 13 weeks of unemployment compensation beyond what a state law would provide, and that's through December 2020. So this is meant to, the first provision is meant to increase the payment. The second provision is intended to increase the length of UI benefits. Now, another key piece is that the legislation also expands what we would characterize as eligibility for unemployment insurance. So there's a parallel program that's set up for those individuals traditionally not eligible for unemployment compensation. This is really intended to cover self-employed, independent contractors, gig workers, and those that are limited in their ability to work as a result of COVID-19. And under this particular program, these eligible individuals who are otherwise not eligible for unemployment compensation, they would be eligible for a similar benefit for up to 39 weeks, and this would also end in December 2020. And this is another program that the federal government would be reimbursing the states for. There are a few other smaller unemployment insurance-related provisions, some related to reimbursement of governmental entities and nonprofits to pay for UC, and also basically to the extent that a state may allow for individuals to receive UC as soon as they become unemployed, rather than usually it takes about a week for them. There's a waiting period until they're eligible. The federal government is willing to compensate for that as well. Another key piece here is that the federal government is intending to help support state programs that allow for short-term compensation. So these are provisions where if an employer reduces the number of hours, that there could be some eligibility for compensation programs related to that as well. So from that, let me transition the discussion to now move into the buckets of funding that are available in this bill. And, as Paul mentioned early on, this is a large bill, $2.2 trillion. And I'll say, one of the things that's happened, just given the fact of how quickly COVID-19 has progressed, number one, but number two, how quickly the government has been moving. A lot of these programs have been authorized on a pretty high level. And the idea is that the governmental agencies that are then authorized to implement these programs are really building it as we go. They're putting out guidance, establishing these programs. In certain instances, the programs have already, there may be a parallel in our recent history that allows for them to adapt what we've done before. But, I think the one way I've been describing it is that we're building the plane in the air. And that's certainly the case with a number of these provisions that I'm going to talk a little bit about. So let me start first on the healthcare side. And the CARES Act allocates $100 billion to healthcare providers for healthcare-related expenses or lost revenues that are attributable to COVID and not reimbursed through other sources. And what these entities, the definition of eligible entities is public entities, Medicare or Medicaid enrolled suppliers and providers, such as not-for-profit entities and for-profit entities, that the Secretary can then describe in more detail. And what the available resources are for is providing diagnoses, testing, care for individuals, as well as funding that's available for building or constructing temporary structures, leasing of property, medical supplies and equipment for PPE and testing supplies, increased workforce and training, emergency operations centers, retrofitting facilities, and surge capacity. This funding is largely going to be made available through grants or other mechanisms that are going to then be implemented by HHS. So that's still to be determined about how these monies are going to be allocated. I think there is broad-based thinking that given how significant the impact is going to be with COVID-19, this $100 billion is really just the beginning of what's going to be required. And one of the things that we've been starting to hear a little bit about is, there are two different types of elements, to be very simplistic about it, that are impacted in the healthcare system. One are the hospital systems and other emergency systems that are being put in place to react specifically to COVID-19 versus those that are maybe physician practices or other elements of the healthcare system, which are sort of seeing a slowdown in their business. And even though this $100 billion does seem to implicate that second group, our thinking right now, and again, this is based on just our sense from what was intended, our conversations on the Hill, and we'll see this in more detail as it's implemented, is that really these monies are allocated for that first bucket. It's really the emergency response. And that second bucket of other parts of the healthcare system that may be implicated, it may be that the other types of funding mechanisms we're going to talk about are more appropriate for them, or maybe more available for them. And so that's really the system that's been put in place for the healthcare piece. Again, more to come as we see guidance from HHS about how this is going to be implemented. And one other piece in terms of the grant funding, according to the legislation, this funding will be provided on an ongoing basis, on a rolling basis. So, what that does mean is that one level of prioritization is going to involve who comes first to the table. With that, let me move on to other types of credit facilities and loan facilities that have been made available under the legislation. And here, I'm going to start on the larger employer side, and then again turn it over to Brenden here in just a minute on the small business side. But there is a provision under what is characterized now as Section 4003 of the CARES Act, and it basically has two different parts to it. One is a set of loan guarantees from the Treasury Department that are specifically allocated for what we characterize as particularly impacted industries. So these are the industries that are articulated here are passenger air carriers, cargo air carriers, and national security businesses. These loan guarantees from Treasury to these particular types of business models, there are, again, directed amounts that would be going to these industries. And we anticipate that what was negotiated in the bill was also a result of what was agreed upon by the industry. And so there are some pretty specific requirements as a result of accepting these dollars, including workforce type protections and other types of restrictions in being able to access the funds. The other provision that I wanted to talk about is what's being characterized as B4 of Section 4003. And this is a larger credit facility that is going to be established under Treasury and the Federal Reserve at $454 billion. And here, this is a fascinating part of the bill. it takes up 25% or 25% of the funding, and really there's very little statutory guidance about what is required as part of this credit facility. There are suggestions by Congress that some of these monies be used for small to mid-sized businesses, so that delta between the small business programs and the very large businesses, so that would be with it for employers that have between 500 and 10,000 employees. But again, it's largely a suggestion, and this facility itself has a number of pretty significant restrictions in those dollars. So as a suggestion, you know, I think one of the things we're going to see first, probably as early as this week, because we don't have guidance just yet, is how that larger tranche of that $454 billion, what that credit facility looks like. Our sense of what this is going to look like is that it's going to be modeled quite a bit on what we saw coming out of the 2008 financial crisis and what was established under the ESA facility and TARP specifically. So what we'll see are capital infusions to particular types of businesses where Treasury has very broad discretion about what types of investments they want to make. And so, again, it's more to come here. We don't have a lot of detail just yet. It's a very short part of the bill. But again, some of those restrictions that we did see in the loan and loan guarantee programs for the particularly impacted industries that I just described, passenger air, cargo air, and national security businesses, those restrictions are not necessarily going to be in place from a statutory perspective for the larger $454 billion facility, but it certainly is within Treasury's purview to be able to provide those restrictions. So more to come here, and certainly I think this is going to be of particular interest to many businesses as they're looking to help deal with cash flow issues in the immediate term. And with that, let me turn it over to Brenden.
Karishma, before we move on, we have one remaining question in the chat.
Absolutely.
So the $600 for UI will also come from state. Do you know when employees will start seeing the $600 addition?
That's a very good question. So another complication here is that, you know, because UI is a state and federal program, often in UI there are agreements between the state government and the federal government about that particular state's program. So what's interesting in the bill is that the state has to come to an agreement with the federal government, and basically once that agreement is in place, that's when that $600 additional payment will start flowing through. So there is a little bit of negotiation that still needs to happen between the various states and federal governments, and we assume that that will be happening or already has happened, but that's really sort of the timing piece. As soon as that state is able to come to that agreement, then that's when the flow of that $600 comes through.
Thanks, Karishma.
All right, Brenden, please tell us more about the small business impact.
Sure. So my name is Brenden Chainey. I'm an associate here in the K&L Gates Public Policy Group, and I've been tracking the small business provisions in the stimulus bill. So in the last phase 3 stimulus bill, the federal government set aside approximately $377 billion for small businesses. The government also modified existing programs and created a new program to push this money out to small businesses throughout the country. So there are sort of 3 main 8 buckets for small businesses under the stimulus bill. The first bucket is basically a bucket that sends subsidies directly to small businesses who have pre-existing SBA loans. These subsidies are basically used to allow the SBA to pay the principal, interest, and any fees associated with these loans for 6 months on existing 7A 504, or any sort of micro loans that a business may have. The second big bucket of aid that the federal government set aside is for businesses, small businesses, to tap into SBA's disaster loan program. So that program has been around for a few years. And within that program, there is an economic injury disaster loan program. So under this program, small businesses with less than 500 employees, that number can change based on the SBA's small business criteria. And so it can change based on industry, but usually it's between 500 and 1,500 employees for certain industries. But for small businesses underneath the SBA's definition, they can apply for an economic injury loan. And through this loan, they can basically borrow up to $2 million in working capital. So these loans can be used for sort of a number of different things. So they can be used for payroll, paid sick leave, meeting increased costs to obtain materials. It can be used for rent, interest on mortgage payments, and sort of repaying any obligations that can't be met because the businesses has seen revenue losses because of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, in terms of this program, there is no personal guarantee for any loans under $200,000, but for loans above that, they require personal guarantee and they require collateral. Usually the SBA likes to seek real estate as collateral, but if you don't have any real estate, then they'll take a look at your other assets to see what else will serve as potential collateral. Now, underneath this program, the Congress basically also created an additional grant program. So for businesses that apply for the program, they can also apply for a $10,000 advance, and it's a grant. So the way it would work is a business or sole proprietor or self-employed person would apply for the program, and then if they needed some money immediately, they could apply for up to $10,000 grant from the SBA, and the SBA would have to distribute the money within 3 days. Now, if the business, if the underlying loan is actually denied for the business, then the business still gets to keep the $10,000, and it's just considered a grant and forgiven. So the sort of last big, one other thing about the economic injury loan program, the loans aren't forgivable. So any money you borrow underneath this program, you'll have to pay back to the SBA. And so that sort of leads us actually into the third big bucket of aid for small businesses. And that is actually a new program. It's called the Paycheck Protection Program. So basically Congress set aside $349 billion within the existing SBA 7A program to get loans out to small businesses. Now, the great thing about this program is that the loans don't require any sort of personal guarantee or collateral, and the loans are actually forgivable. And so we'll talk about the sort of forgiveness process in a second. These loans can be used to pay for a few different things. This includes sort of salaries and wages, rent, utilities, benefit costs, interest paid on mortgages. And the way they actually calculate the loan is that your lender would take a look at how much you spend on payroll, rent, utilities, mortgage interest payments over the previous 12 months starting in January, and come up with your average monthly spend. They'll then take that number and multiply it by 2.5. Now the 2.5 number, the way they came up with that is basically that is 2 months worth of these costs I just mentioned, with an additional 25% thrown on top. So after doing the calculation and multiplying it by 2.5, they'll come up with a number. If the number is over $10 million, then you're sorry, then the business is only allowed to borrow $10 million. If it's less than $10 million, then whatever that number is the amount of loan that is available to the business. So how does this work in sort of real life? Let's say you go to a lender, they determine that your average monthly spend is $1 million. They multiply the $1 million times 2.5 and allow you to borrow up to $2.5 million. For other businesses, that number may be $12 or $15 million. And at that point, they're only allowed to borrow $10 million. So the really cool thing about this program is that there's a loan forgiveness provision. And basically the reason why the government included this provision in the act is a couple of different reasons. One, they want to incentivize employers to maintain, to keep their employees on payroll or to bring back anyone who they had laid off. And then two, they wanted to have a loan program that sort of got small businesses through the COVID crisis and some sort of in some sort of way that allowed them to basically kind of stay whole. So the way the loan forgiveness provision works is, let's say I go as a business person, a small business, and borrow $2.5 million from the government. And then I spend the $2 million of that on some preset categories. So salary and wages, rent, utilities, the cost of benefits. So like I said, I spent $2 million on this. The lender will basically forgive the $2 million I spent on these sort of pre-set up categories, and I will only owe $500,000 that I spent on other sort of other things. Now, the actual potential for loan forgiveness can actually be reduced in two different ways. And both has to do with how many employees you keep on staff and how much you're paying them. So the first way is determined by looking at the average number of full-time employees who were on payroll before February 15th. And then, I guess between February 15th and June 30th of this year versus last year. So let's say you had 50 people on payroll before February 15th. But then you let some people go, and at that point, after June 30th, you had 40 people on staff. So taking a look at that, the government or the lender would basically determine that you had a 20% reduction in force. So take that 20%, multiply it by the number that will include the salary and wages, rent, utilities, benefit costs, and it'll basically reduce that forgivable amount by that 20%. So let's say in the instance of the $2 million, let's say the potential forgivable amount is $2 million, but I had a 20% reduction in workforce. They'll multiply the 20% by $2 million and it will that number down. The second way that sort of the potential forgivable amount can be reduced is through salary reductions over 25%. So let's say you have a bunch of employees, you get this money from a lender, and you reduce salaries more than 25% for the majority of your employees. Let's say you do it by 30%. So the lender will subtract the 25% from the 30% and say, okay, your salary and wages went down basically by 5%. So we'll see what that number is and basically subtract it from the amount that you're eligible to be forgiven. So let's say, they did the calculation, the amount of the 5% amount equals something like $400,000. They'll subtract the $400,000 from the $2 million that you potentially have for loan forgiveness. And so those are the sort of the three main buckets that the federal government is using in order to sort of get money out to small businesses. Like I said, I think the Paycheck Protection Program is sort of really the big program that the federal government is using to get money out to people. But you know, the other two buckets also are designed to allow small businesses to, like I said, maintain staff and get through this crisis.
Brenden, we have one question in the chat.
Sure.
Are nonprofits eligible to apply for these small business loans, in particular Paycheck Protection Program?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean, for both, they have they allow a bunch of different entities to apply for the programs. So let's stick with the Paycheck Protection Program. So if small businesses can apply, nonprofits, veterans organizations, tribal businesses, self-employed, sole proprietors, they all can apply as long as they fall within the SBA size standard.
Thank you, Brenden. And one additional question. Is the SBA disaster loan program available now at most lenders, or are they being set up?
So the way it works is, so the economic injury disaster loan program is available through the SBA. You can go on their website and you can apply either through a paper form or through online on their system. And so that's available right now. And for the Paycheck Protection Program, they actually just released the form for that program. Yes. So it's, you know, depending on how quickly the SBA approved lender moves, then you most likely can apply for that program within one of the SBA's, you know, partner lender network. I think right now it's like 1,800 lenders, but they're trying to expand it to a bunch of other sort of financial institutions to try to get as much money out into the economy as quickly as possible. So, you know, if you have a pre-existing relationship with a bank or a credit union or a S7A lender, going to talk to them about the program, they'll probably have the application and they'll probably start to be able to work with you on the application. Taking a look at some guidance that the SBA had put out on their website, they're really pushing these lenders to get these loans out as quickly as possible. So you have an instance in which, you know, you could walk in, sit down with your lender, they could run the calculations, you have all your information, and then you could, you know, potentially, you know, get the loan the same day. That sort of, you know, that sort of quickness. But that's in terms of the two programs, that is what is available out there right now.
Thank you, Brenden. And one follow-up question, is the Paycheck Protection Program the same as the grant program?
No, so there are two different, so you have a grant program underneath the economic injury disaster loan program, and that's up to $10,000. And if you apply for a loan underneath the disaster loan program with SBA, then you can also apply for a $10,000 immediate advance. So that's one thing. The Paycheck Protection Act is a loan program that has a forgiveness provision that you would apply for with an outside institution that is not SBA. So it would be like a bank, a traditional 7A lender, a credit union, and then there are other types of financial institutions that SBA wants to have enter the program. So.
Thanks, Brenden. Another question came in.
Mm-hmm.
For self-employed persons, such as cosmetologists, are they eligible for UI benefits? And what are the parameters related to taxes, et cetera?
I think that's probably a better question for Karishma and Mary. So if they want to chime in, that's fine.
Yeah, I could take the UI piece and then turn it over to Mary. The UI piece is under one of the new UI expansions under the CARES Act, they do contemplate making it available to self-employed individuals that are then impacted by COVID-19. So generally that it would be the case that it would be available to those types of individuals who had previously not been eligible. But again, they would have to have had the specific impact as required by COVID-19, and that will be further articulated through the state or district that would then be implementing those benefits. And then I'll turn it over to Mary on the tax question.
The tax question is a good question. Unemployment benefits generally are subject to, they are taxable, and there's nothing in the statute that would relax that standard. So as far as we can tell, the intention is that even the additional $600 that's received per week would be taxable income. In other sections of the statute of the CARES Act, for example, the loan forgiveness that Brenden was just talking about, they clarify, normally if you have a loan forgiven, that's taxable income to you, but they clarify that that is not taxable cancellation of indebtedness under the CARES Act, but there's no corollary type of provision in the unemployment benefits section, so we believe that it's all continues to be taxable. Now that varies according to state law. That could, some states have conformity with the federal on unemployment benefits and whether or not they're taxable, so the states could vary, but for federal purposes, it's taxable.
And are they able to get the benefit if they did not pay taxes?
Well, if they're not paying taxes, they probably, yeah, that's an interesting question. If you're unemployed and you're not paying taxes, I just had this conversation with someone yesterday about the individual rebates and going online with the IRS and giving your information and hoping you're going to be able to get a rebate. You're putting yourself at risk. Not to say that the IRS is going to be combing through all the unemployment claims to determine, well, they're filing for unemployment, but they will need to have a history of income, and if they are not paying taxes, I just think I'm not saying they can't get unemployment benefits. I don't know enough about how the various programs are operated in the states, but I think they're putting themselves at some risk by not complying with the tax laws, but wanting to get the benefit of the unemployment benefits.
Thank you, Mary. And one last question. Can a small business apply for both SBA economic disaster loan and the PPP?
So the statute says that, so similar to the tax provisions, that they don't want people to do basically double dipping. Waiting on the regulations for the Paycheck Protection Program to see if that means that if you got money from the Economic Injury Loan Program, let's say up to $2 million, whether or not that just means that you can borrow less underneath, or potentially less underneath the underneath the Paycheck Protection Act. So if I got $2 million underneath the disaster loan program, and then I would only be eligible to get $8 million underneath the Paycheck Protection Act. That, that is sort of the assumption that is out there. But still waiting on the regulations for the Paycheck Protection Act to clarify that particular sort of issue.
Thank you, Brenden.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, sorry, Najee. So here, this is Jack McDougall again. And so we're out of time. And I really want to thank everybody for joining us today. And especially, Paul, I want to thank you and your team from K&L Gates, Karishma, Brenden, and Mary. That was really helpful and very informative. There's so much more to come. And there's a lot to kind of just wrap your head around with everything that we're dealing with these days. So thank you very much. Please, we'll be hosting a whole host of other briefings similar to this. So please look out for those and join us if you're available. And everybody take care and stay safe. So thank you very much.